There was a plant that fed people for thousands of years. It required no chemicals, no pruning, and almost no human intervention. Once planted, it produced food not for a season, not for a decade, but for nearly half a lifetime. It survived droughts, neglect, and harsh winters. It grew quietly on the edges of farms, along old homesteads, and near forgotten fences. And yet today, it is treated as if it never mattered. In modern America, this plant is rarely mentioned. It does not appear in gardening catalogs. It is not promoted by nurseries. Agricultural advice rarely brings it up. In many places, it is dismissed as unproductive, outdated, or simply not worth the space. Some even consider it useless. Others see it as a nuisance. A plant that once sustained families is now invisible. That disappearance did not happen because the plant stopped working. It did not happen because science proved it inferior. And it did not happen because a better alternative was discovered. In fact, measured by lifespan, total yield, and long-term reliability, this plant outperforms one of the most popular fruits in America today. Blueberries are celebrated as a modern superfood. They are heavily marketed, carefully bred, and widely planted. But most blueberry bushes are productive for only a short window of time. They demand pruning, soil manipulation, fertilizers, and chemical protection. When they decline, they are removed and replaced. The plant you are about to hear about does not follow that pattern. It never did. And that is precisely why it was left behind. Because a plant that feeds people for decades without asking for anything in return does not fit the system that replaced it. The plant itself is not exotic. It is not tropical. It does not require special soil blends or controlled environments. It is a hardy, cold-tolerant berry shrub that once grew naturally across large parts of North America. Long before commercial blueberries were standardized, this plant was already established in farm hedgerows, woodland edges, and homesteads where it quietly produced year after year. Unlike modern berry bushes bred for uniform size and shipping durability, this plant evolved to survive. Its roots grow deep and wide, anchoring it through drought and cold. Its genetics are diverse, not narrowed by decades of laboratory selection. That diversity is precisely what makes it resilient. Pests do not overwhelm it easily. Diseases do not spread through it the way they do in tightly controlled monocultures. It does not rely on constant human correction to function. Once established, the plant settles into a rhythm that can last for decades. It does not exhaust itself after a few seasons. It does not require annual pruning to remain productive. It does not collapse without fertilizer. Instead, it grows slowly, steadily, and predictably. Each year it produces a reliable harvest, not in dramatic peaks, but in consistent returns that add up over time. What makes this plant fundamentally different from modern blueberries is not flavor or appearance, it is lifespan. Commercial blueberry bushes are designed for short-term productivity. They peak quickly, decline early, and are replaced. This plant was never designed to be replaced. It was meant to stay. Farm families understood this intuitively. They planted it not for immediate yield, but for the future. Children grew up harvesting from the same plants their parents had planted. In many cases, those plants were still producing when grandchildren were born. The idea of removing a productive bush simply because it was old would have seemed absurd. Yet today, that way of thinking feels foreign. Gardening advice emphasizes speed control and optimization. Plants are treated as temporary assets rather than long-term partners. In that world, a berry bush that quietly produces for 4 decades without intervention is not impressive. It is inconvenient. And so it was gradually pushed aside, not because it failed, but because it refused to conform. When agricultural records from the early 20th century are examined, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The difference between this plant and modern blueberries is not incremental. It is structural, it is mathematical, and it is measured not in a single season, but across an entire lifetime. A mature plant of this type typically produces between 20 and 50 pounds of fruit each year once fully established. That production does not peak and collapse. It stabilizes. After the fourth or fifth year, yields remain remarkably consistent. Extension documents and farm journals from the 1920s and 1930s repeatedly describe bushes still producing reliable harvests after 30 or even 40 years in the ground. When those numbers are extended across time, the scale becomes clear. At the low end, 20 pounds per year over 40 years results in 800 pounds of fruit from a single planting. At the higher end, 50 pounds per year over the same period reaches 2,000 pounds. This is not theoretical modelling. These figures come from observed recorded plants that were never replanted and rarely modified. Now compare that to the modern commercial blueberry bush. Even under ideal management, most hybrid varieties reach peak production for only a limited window. Typical yields range from 5 to 8 pounds per year. Productive lifespan is often measured in years rather than decades. After 10 to 15 years, output declines sharply. Bushes are removed, replaced, and replanted. Over its entire usable life, a modern blueberry bush may produce between 70 and 100 pounds of fruit before it is considered no longer worth keeping. This means that a single, long-lived berry plant can produce 10 to 20 times more total food than a modern blueberry bush occupying the same space. And it does so without repeated planting, without soil replacement, and without the continuous inputs required to maintain commercial productivity. Labor tells a similar story. Modern blueberries demand regular pruning to control size, stimulate fruiting, and prevent disease. They require soil acidification, frequent fertilization, and chemical intervention to control pests that thrive in genetically uniform plantings. Each of these steps adds cost, effort, and dependence. The older perennial berry does not eliminate work entirely, but it dramatically reduces it. Pruning is optional rather than mandatory. Fertilization improves yield but is not required for survival or basic productivity. Pest pressure remains lower due to genetic diversity and ecological integration. Over decades, the cumulative labor savings become substantial. What these numbers reveal is not just a more productive plant, but a different philosophy of food production. One prioritizes immediate returns and repeat transactions. The other prioritizes longevity, stability, and cumulative yield. On paper, the second approach is more efficient. In practice, it is far less profitable for industries built on replacement. And that difference explains far more than flavor ever could. During the early decades of the 20th century, this plant was not obscure. It was not hidden. It was not fringe knowledge. It appeared in agricultural bulletins, extension pamphlets, and farm journals distributed across the country. In the 1920s, when American agriculture was still shaped by household resilience rather than industrial scale, this berry plant was presented as practical, dependable, and economically sensible. Extension services at the time focused heavily on food security. Their audience was not corporations or export markets, but families. Publications emphasized plants that could survive neglect, recover from bad seasons, and continue producing without constant expense. This perennial berry fit that mission precisely. It was recommended for farm edges, windbreaks, and mixed plantings where it could produce food without competing for prime cropland. Farm journals from the period describe it as a background crop. Not glamorous, not fashionable, but reliable. It was not meant to replace all other fruits. It was meant to ensure that something would always be there. In years when annual crops failed, these bushes still produced. In years of labor shortages, they still fruited. They were described as insurance, not opportunity. This perspective became especially important during periods of instability. As the Great Depression unfolded, households were forced to rely more heavily on what they could grow themselves. Plants that demanded minimal inputs became more valuable, not less. This berry plant continued to appear in extension recommendations as a sensible addition to home food systems, particularly for families with limited time or resources. During the Second World War, the logic remained the same. Victory gardens are often remembered for annual vegetables, but perennial food plants played a quiet role as well. Extension materials emphasized long-term productivity and reduced labor wherever possible. A bush that could continue producing year after year without replanting aligned perfectly with a population stretched thin by rationing and labor demands. At no point in these documents is the plant described as inferior. It is not criticized for low yield. It is not dismissed as outdated. Instead, it is presented as dependable, durable, and sufficient. Those qualities mattered deeply in a time when survival was prioritized over optimization. What changed was not the plant. What changed was the definition of success. As agriculture shifted toward scale uniformity and profit margins, the language of extension services shifted as well. Plants were no longer evaluated by how long they fed people, but by how efficiently they moved through markets. And quietly, without announcement, this berry plant stopped appearing in recommendations. After the war, the priorities of American agriculture shifted rapidly. The goal was no longer household resilience. It was scale. It was efficiency. It was predictability measured in quarterly returns rather than generational stability. Farming began to reorganize itself around machinery, chemical inputs, and standardized crops that could be controlled, replicated, and sold repeatedly. This transition reshaped which plants were considered valuable. Annual crops fit the new system perfectly. They required replanting every year. They depended on fertilizers and pest control. They created a steady demand for seeds, equipment, and chemicals. Perennial food plants did not. Once established, they produced without asking much in return. From an industrial perspective, that independence was a problem. At the same time, plant breeding accelerated. Fruit crops were selected not for longevity, but for uniformity. Berries needed to ripen at the same time. They needed to look identical. They needed to survive long-distance transport. Flavor resilience and lifespan became secondary concerns. The long-lived berry plant did not meet these criteria. Its fruit varied slightly from bush to bush. Its harvest window was extended rather than synchronized. Its value was cumulative, not immediate. Nurseries adapted quickly. Selling a plant that would remain productive for 40 years made little economic sense when compared to varieties that needed replacement after a decade. Garden centers depend on repeat customers. A household that plants once and harvests for decades quietly exits that cycle. Over time, nurseries stopped propagating the older berry. Not because customers complained, but because it disrupted the business model. Extension services followed the same path. As their focus shifted toward commercial producers, recommendations narrowed. Research funding prioritized crops with market potential. Plants that could not be patented, branded, or scaled were no longer studied. Without new research, they stopped being mentioned. Without mention, knowledge faded. There was no announcement, no warning, no declaration that the plant was obsolete. It simply disappeared from catalogs, bulletins, and conversations. When cold winters damaged older plantings in marginal regions, few people replanted. Replacement varieties were what nurseries offered. Within a single generation, the memory of a bush that quietly fed families for decades was largely erased. What replaced it was not necessarily better. It was more profitable, and in a system that equates profitability with progress, that distinction mattered less than it should have. The economic logic behind this shift is rarely stated directly, but it governs nearly every decision in modern food systems. Plants are not evaluated only by how much food they produce. They are evaluated by how often money changes hands around them. Seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, soil amendments, equipment replacement, stock, and professional services all depend on repetition. A plant that reduces repetition reduces revenue. Long-lived perennial food plants break this cycle. They require fewer purchases over time. They do not create predictable annual demand. Once established, they operate largely outside the commercial loop. From the perspective of households, this is a strength. From the perspective of industries built on recurring sales, it is a weakness. Seed companies cannot rely on a customer who buys once and never returns. Chemical manufacturers cannot depend on plants that resist pests naturally. Nurseries cannot sustain profits when a plant occupies the same space for decades without replacement. Even research institutions face a problem. Funding tends to follow industries that promise growth. A crop that stabilizes rather than expands attracts little investment. This does not require coordination or conspiracy. It emerges naturally from incentives. Each part of the system rewards plants that need help, not plants that thrive on their own. Over time, recommendations, research priorities, and consumer awareness align around those incentives. What is profitable becomes visible. What is sufficient fades into the background. The long-lived berry plant illustrates this perfectly. It does not scale cleanly into industrial production. It does not ripen all at once. It does not ship well over long distances. Its value is local, cumulative, and slow. These traits make it ideal for households and homesteads. They make it nearly invisible to large markets. As a result, the narrative around productivity becomes distorted. Yield is discussed per season rather than per lifetime. Efficiency is measured by speed rather than endurance. Plants are judged by how quickly they pay back investment, not by how long they continue to feed people. In this framework, a berry bush that produces modestly but reliably for 40 years appears inefficient even when its total output far exceeds modern alternatives. This shift in measurement quietly reshaped public understanding. Gardeners were taught to expect replacement. Farmers were taught to accept decline as normal. Longevity became an anomaly rather than a goal. When a plant survived too long without intervention, it was no longer seen as remarkable. It was simply ignored. What was lost was not just a crop, but a way of thinking. A system that once valued stability learned to value turnover instead. And plants that embodied long-term resilience no longer fit the story agriculture was telling about itself. Today, the consequences of that quiet removal are visible everywhere, even if they are rarely named. Most households depend almost entirely on long supply chains for food that was once produced locally. A disruption thousands of miles away can empty shelves within days. When transport falters, when weather shifts, when labor shortages appear, access to basic produce becomes uncertain. This dependence would have seemed risky to earlier generations. Families once maintained layers of food security. Annual crops provided volume. Perennial plants provided continuity. If one failed, the other remained. The disappearance of long-lived food plants removed that redundancy. What replaced it was efficiency without resilience. Gardening culture changed as well. Many people now accept that planting, harvesting, and discarding is normal. Plants are expected to perform quickly and then decline. When they do, replacement feels inevitable rather than avoidable. Few question why a fruit bush should stop being productive after a decade. Fewer still ask whether that decline is natural or designed. The loss is not only practical, it is cultural. Knowledge that once passed quietly between generations has been interrupted. Many people living today grew up without ever seeing a berry bush older than they were. They never witnessed a plant that matured alongside a family feeding it steadily year after year. Without that reference point, permanence feels unrealistic. This absence shapes expectations. When food prices rise, people look outward rather than inward. When shortages occur, solutions are framed as logistical rather than biological. The idea that resilience could be rooted in the ground itself feels foreign, even radical. Yet the plant discussed here never stopped existing. It did not vanish because the climate rejected it. It vanished because attention moved elsewhere. And with that shift, households lost not just a crop, but an option. An option for stability. An option for independence. An option that once required nothing more than patience and memory. In recent years, this plant has begun to reappear not through institutions, but through individuals. It survives in overlooked places, along old fence lines, on abandoned farmsteads, in the margins of rural properties where no one bothered to remove it. Some of the bushes still producing today were planted before the middle of the last century. They were never replaced because they never failed. Researchers and small-scale growers who encounter these plants often arrive at the same conclusion independently. There is nothing wrong with them. Their productivity may not surge in dramatic bursts, but it persists. Year after year, they continue doing what they were always meant to do: feed people quietly. Recovery does not require advanced technology. It requires recognition. Once identified, the plant is easy to propagate. Cuttings root readily. Seeds remain viable. It tolerates a wide range of soils. It does not demand constant attention. In appropriate climates, it integrates naturally into mixed plantings, food forests, and backyard gardens. What has changed is not the biology. It is the context. For decades, resilience was treated as irrelevant. Now it is discussed daily. Supply chains are fragile. Input costs rise. Households are once again forced to consider what they can rely on when systems strain. In that environment, a plant that asks for little and gives for decades begins to make sense again. Reviving this plant is not about rejecting modern agriculture entirely. It is about restoring balance. Annual crops still have a role. Speed still matters. But so does continuity. Perennial food plants provide a foundation that does not collapse when conditions change. They offer a form of security that cannot be shipped, patented, or outsourced. For many people, encountering this plant for the first time feels unsettling. Not because it is unfamiliar, but because it reveals what was missing. It shows that dependence was not inevitable. It was chosen, and choices can be revisited. The act of planting such a bush today is quiet. There is no announcement, no immediate payoff. But over time, it becomes something rare in modern life. A constant, a source of food that does not need to be reordered. A reminder that some of the most effective solutions were never lost. They were simply ignored. At this point, the question is no longer about plants. It is about choices. If a food-producing bush can feed people for decades without chemicals, without replanting, and without constant dependence on outside inputs, then its disappearance demands an explanation. And that explanation forces a decision. If efficiency means speed replacement and permanent dependence, then this plant does not belong in modern gardens. But if efficiency means stability, cumulative yield, and independence over time, then removing it was not progress. It was a loss. So here is the question that cannot be avoided. If something works better for households, but worse for the system that sells to them, should it be preserved or forgotten? If you believe this plant deserved to disappear, comment the number 9 below. If you believe removing it was a mistake, do not comment. Press like instead. One action or the other is required. Silence is not an option. What you are hearing in this series is not gardening advice. It is not nostalgia. It is an attempt to recover knowledge that was quietly removed, not because it failed, but because it worked too well for ordinary people. This channel exists to document those losses, to trace how they happened, and to show what still remains for anyone willing to look. If this perspective feels uncomfortable, that is intentional. Forgotten solutions tend to challenge the assumptions we have learned to accept. If it feels familiar, that matters even more. It may mean you recognize something that once existed and should not have been erased. If you want to see more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Each episode examines one plant, one practice, or one piece of knowledge that fed people reliably before it disappeared from public awareness. There are many more. Long-lived grains, perennial vegetables, trees that replaced entire supply chains. Most of them are still here. They are simply no longer discussed. The choice is not between past and present. It is between dependence and memory. And memory, once recovered, has a way of spreading quietly on its own.